push it over here. Yeah, that's better. Okay. Good morning. Today, the House Armed Services Committee meets to receive testimony on Al-Qaeda in 2010. How should the U.S. respond? Our witnesses today, Richard Clarke, currently an adjunct lecturer at Harvard University and previously the National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism. Juan Zarate, Senior Advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the former Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism. Steve Coll, President of the New America Foundation and the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden from the Soviet invasion to September 10, 2001. We welcome you and we thank our witnesses for being with us. Since the attacks on September 11, 2001, the United States has acted forcefully to disrupt and defeat Al-Qaeda and to eliminate their safe havens in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I firmly support our ongoing efforts in Afghanistan. I believe it's vital that we succeed there, and I commend the President on his recent decision to increase our force levels in that conflict. But as the attempted bombing of an airliner over Detroit on Christmas Day by an Al-Qaeda affiliate reminds us, even as we pursue bin Laden and his allies in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Al-Qaeda has continued to evolve as an organization and inspiration to terrorist groups around the world. In order for us to combat this evolving threat, I believe we must understand the state of Al-Qaeda and how it has changed over the years. In this effort, the committee's hearing today with outside experts builds on the classified briefing we held recently in past full committee hearings. The Terrorism and Unconventional Threats Subcommittee, led by Adam Smith and Jeff Miller, have done great work in this area over the years, and I'm sure will continue to do so under the leadership of Chairwoman Loretta Sanchez. The title of this hearing, Al-Qaeda in 2010, How Should the U.S. Respond?, poses a deceptively simple question that I hope our witnesses can help us with. But the real questions are harder. What is Al-Qaeda today, and how has that organization evolved? How can the United States government, and in particular the Department of Defense, take effective action to end the threat posed by Al-Qaeda, its allies, its affiliates around the globe? What tools do we have, and how should we employ them? How can we undermine their media campaign and attempt to provide an ideology justifying attacks against the United States? In short, what actions can we and should we take to minimize the chances that we are faced with future attacks like the attempted attack on Christmas? I hope our witnesses can help us with these questions. By the way, this is a reminder today, a members-only meeting, a China briefing at 2:30 this afternoon in room 2118, our new old committee room, and you will be pleased when you come back and see the work that's been done there. I turn our friend, the ranking gentleman from California, Buck McKeon, for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for holding today's hearing on Al-Qaeda and the continuing threat that it poses. For nearly 2 decades, Al-Qaeda has waged war against the U.S., its citizens, and the modern world. We may not have fully realized the destructive nature of Al-Qaeda until the tragic events of 9/11, but we must not allow our determination and vigilance to wane. We can be assured that Al-Qaeda remains as relentless and as violent as ever, and today's hearing allows us to better understand Al-Qaeda and what must be done to protect our nation and its citizens. I would also like to welcome our witnesses. Your insights today are extremely important given the influx of additional troops to Afghanistan in support of General McChrystal's strategy and given recent events such as the Christmas Day airline bombing attempt and the Fort Hood shootings. We look forward to your testimony. We cannot forget that we're a nation at war. Al-Qaeda stormed into the public view with the horrific acts of 9/11, but well before that time had been plotting and acting against us. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya, the failed attack against the USS The Sullivans, and the successful attack on the USS Coll in 2000 all presaged what was to come in 2001. Al-Qaeda had already declared war on us. Only after the World Trade Center bombings, the Pentagon, and a Pennsylvania field were burning did we fully appreciate that fact. I was heartened when, on December 1st, 2009, President Obama officially took ownership of the war in Afghanistan and the broader war on terrorism during a speech at West Point. He is our nation's commander-in-chief and plays the critical role of guiding the United States during wartime. Al-Qaeda, operating from safe havens in Afghanistan, brought war upon our nation, and our message must be clear. We will not back down from those who seek to do us harm. We have denied Al-Qaeda operating space in Afghanistan, but must ensure our efforts to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven once again do not waver. The administration's decision to support General McChrystal's counterinsurgency strategy is an important step towards stabilizing the country and, importantly, in degrading Al-Qaeda's operational capability. I'm gravely concerned, however, about the announcement of a timeline in conjunction with the decision. We must allow events and conditions on the ground to be the basis for any decisions on our Afghanistan strategy, not Washington politics. And I have to wonder, has President Obama emboldened our adversaries by revealing a lack of commitment on our part, or like his proclamation that Guantanamo Bay would close by January 2010, does this hint to an administration that does not fully understand the ramifications of its actions and statements? We must remember, however, that Afghanistan is not the sole focus in this struggle. Pakistan is a key partner for us, as Al-Qaeda has been forced to seek refuge in tribal areas controlled by the extremist Taliban. Pakistani forces have gained important victories in their attempt to root out Al-Qaeda and its hosts from Waziristan and the federally administered tribal areas, but much more needs to be done. We must continue to support Pakistani efforts through intelligence sharing, operational support, and security assistance with vehicles like the Pakistan Counterinsurgency Fund. And we also need to support the Defense Department's 1206 Train and Equip Authority, which it uses elsewhere, to ensure our partners in this struggle have improved capabilities to meet threats to security and stability. Al-Qaeda does not act alone and is a highly adaptable organization. It has leveraged a franchise system to bring like-minded groups around the world under its operational umbrella. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula have all sought to further Al-Qaeda's central goals. What Al-Qaeda seeks is the time and space to allow its affiliates to rise, as in Iraq in 2006-2007, when Al-Qaeda took advantage of ungoverned space to train, plan, and attack the vulnerable Iraqi government, as well as U.S. interests. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula seeks to gain ground in Yemen, where the government forces is fighting not only Al-Qaeda, but also an extremist Shiite insurgency for control of large areas of its country. Further, Al-Qaeda is more and more willing to step out of the spotlight and allow other groups to act as its proxies. Lashkar-e-Taiba in Kashmir and Al-Shabaab in Somalia have helped Al-Qaeda gain a broader audience and extend its operational reach. Al-Qaeda very quickly capitalizes on these groups' actions in the name of its grand strategy. Even in failed or thwarted attacks, Al-Qaeda adjusts its message for greatest effect, always seeking to gain new recruits and enhance its brand image as effective and successful. Therefore, we must be very aware that a reduction in Al-Qaeda's fingerprints on terrorist operations does not necessarily mean that the threat of Al-Qaeda is diminished. Ideology, radicalization, and the media that are available in today's world provide a volatile mix for Al-Qaeda to exploit. while complicating our attempts to identify and focus on Al-Qaeda as an organization. The Little Rock, Arkansas, and Fort Hood shootings and Christmas Day bombing attempt all represent an increasing threat, that of radicalized individuals who attack either on their own or with minimal operational coordination with an Al-Qaeda handler. The hand of Al-Qaeda may not be nearly visible, but the threat remains. The challenges we face are many, but we absolutely must not fail to recognize that we are at war, and our enemy will seek any and all means to advance its cause. We are not facing common criminals, and this fact was reaffirmed on January 5th when the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit upheld the right of U.S. governments to detain combatants. This decision reaffirms the belief that the laws of war are the appropriate foundation for and are needed in our efforts against terrorists who may not wear uniforms but who are waging war against us. I believe the administration would be making a very dangerous mistake were it to treat terrorists as common criminals. While Al-Qaeda operatives may not wear uniforms or follow the Geneva Convention, we cannot ignore the fact that Al-Qaeda is waging war against us and that terrorists are Al-Qaeda's foot soldiers. They do not merely break civil laws, but advance a strategy that seeks to topple governments through terrorism and other means. They cannot be viewed as anything less than prisoners of war. One would think that the President's policy towards Guantanamo Bay's detention facility would reflect the fact that we are at war. Yet he seeks to close the facility without a clear plan and return many detainees to countries rife with ungoverned spaces and Al-Qaeda cells. The remaining population of Guantanamo Bay does not represent chance battlefield detainees or mere supporters, but hardcore operatives. Given recidivism rates that are 20% or higher, the President's position on detention and prosecution of these wartime detainees held there is especially alarming in its incoherence. In response to the administration's irresponsible handling of the detainee issue, we've introduced the Detainee Transfer and Release Security Act of 2010. This legislation will block transfers from Guantanamo to countries with ungoverned spaces, active Al-Qaeda cells or networks, or confirmed cases of a former Guantanamo detainee who was transferred to the fight. Our efforts would have blocked the December transfer of 7 detainees to Yemen and last week's transfer of 2 detainees to Algeria. America cannot be complicit in allowing former detainees to return to the fight against the United States. Our policies and strategies must reflect the fact that we are at war. We should not simply close Guantanamo, and we cannot allow enemy combatants to return to the battlefield. In Al-Qaeda's worldview, the U.S. should not exist. Therefore, in this war, we must seek to defeat our enemy. Measures that fall short of that goal, denying Al-Qaeda operating space, disrupting Al-Qaeda operations, must not enter our lexicon or our thought process. I take it as a personal responsibility to remind my fellow members, my constituents, and my colleagues throughout the government of what is called for in this great struggle. With the fact that we are at war clear, I look forward to our witnesses' input today. We're faced with an enemy that is adaptable, that leverages media extremely well, that promotes a twisted version of one of the world's major religions, and that ultimately is willing to outlast us if that is what is required of it. Your testimony will help us gain greater understanding of how to face those challenges and how we can best shape our strategy, policy, and actions to ensure that we defeat Al-Qaeda in what can only be viewed as a war of survival. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly thank the gentleman. Again, we appreciate the witnesses testifying today, and we'll start with Richard Clarke. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to respond to your request for testimony or other assistance. You asked, what is the status of Al-Qaeda and what should we be doing in way of response to it? These questions have been asked a lot since Christmas, and I think we need to pause for a minute and ask ourselves, what would have happened in this country if that detonator on board that Northwest Delta flight had worked? Because that's really the only difference between a successful attack and the failure that occurred was whether or not that detonator worked. And I'm afraid that if it had worked, a lot of people would have jumped to perhaps the wrong conclusion. They would have thought that because one single terrorist was able to penetrate our defenses and cause the death perhaps of 200 Americans in the United States, that necessarily would have meant that Al-Qaeda was resurgent, or that there was some failure in the policies of the last administration or some failure in the policies of this administration. And the American people would ask themselves why it was the case that over a decade after Al-Qaeda became a major issue for the United States, that we had not been able to eradicate it. I think it's important that we ask ourselves these questions now publicly, because the difference between one detonator working and one detonator not working suggests to me that we could very well have a successful attack. And when we do, if we do, we shouldn't panic, and we shouldn't necessarily jump to the wrong conclusions. So in trying to answer your questions at a very high level, I've structured my response in the form of 7 propositions, and I'll try to go through them quickly, but they're available in the written testimony. The first proposition is that if Al-Qaeda does stage a successful attack, it doesn't in and of itself indicate whether or not they're getting stronger or not. That lone operators will always be a threat, whether they are from Al-Qaeda or from another organization. Modern societies are inherently fragile to lone operator attacks. We saw that with Oklahoma City, where there were just 2 or 3 people involved. We saw it in the Washington area with the Washington sniper. We are always going to face a threat of lone operators. Secondly, many of the groups that we hear about, many of the attacks that we see that are labeled as Al-Qaeda, really are not Al-Qaeda central. They are groups that had existed for years, in some cases for a century, and have been relabeled or have relabeled themselves as Al-Qaeda. And 2 of them, for example, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, have actually imploded in recent years. They lost popular support because of their excesses, and they were also successfully suppressed by security forces. So I think we need to ask ourselves, really, what is Al-Qaeda? And perhaps the best way of looking at it is to focus on Al-Qaeda Central, the organization that attacked us on 9/11, the organization that, unlike the affiliates, has targeted the far enemy, which is the United States. And Al-Qaeda Central has had its ups and downs. It was certainly very strong prior to 9/11. It was hit badly after our invasion of Afghanistan. It had a bit of a resurgence in the last several years. But in the last 2 years, with our increased tempo of operations against their sanctuary in Pakistan, and with the Pakistani government finally doing something about that sanctuary, Al-Qaeda Central is a somewhat reduced threat than it was in the past. Nonetheless, there are affiliate groups that are of concern, and 2 of them in particular seem to have targeted the far enemy, the United States. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, consisting largely of Yemenis and Saudis, seems to now have its intent on going after the United States, including here in the homeland. And certainly the Taliban is engaged in daily combat with the United States. A third group, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, may also be involved in preparing people to attack the homeland. Mr. Chairman, I'll skip over the other propositions there in the testimony, but I think the chief point here is that the eradication of Al-Qaeda is the work of a generation. And it is not something that the American people should believe that any administration will be able to accomplish. Nor should the American people expect that any administration will be able to prevent all successful attacks. And when and if an attack does come, in the United States, despite all of our efforts and despite the fact that we are winning this war. We need to be nonpartisan, we need to be analytical, and we need not to panic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Clarke. Mr. Zarate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member McKeon, distinguished members of the committee, pleased to be with you here today to testify, and I thank you for the invitation. I think it's an important moment to look at the nature of Al-Qaeda, in particular given the past series of events over the last year, plots uncovered, Christmas Day failed attack, the growing role of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and frankly, the continued allure of Al-Qaeda's ideology, including in the homeland. Mr. Chairman, Al-Qaeda is no longer the same organization we faced on September 11, 2001. In many ways, it has been decimated, with the core elements of the organization on the ropes. Al-Qaeda's senior leadership is being methodically destroyed, its primary physical safe haven is being undermined, its ideology is being rejected within Muslim communities around the world, and frankly, its strategy has yet to produce the results promised. At the same time, Al-Qaeda has attempted to spur an ideological awakening among Muslims around the world to fight the West. The allure of this ideology continues to draw adherents and manifests itself in real threats. Some actually argue that Al-Qaeda is actually achieving its goal via the establishment of a virtual caliphate. Thus, I think there is a paradox in which Al-Qaeda as an organization remains in steady decline, but the global terrorist threat inspired by this ideology remains a central national security concern for the United States. This is why I think there's been so much debate, both here in Congress and in academic circles, about the nature of Al-Qaeda. Is it a hierarchical organization, a loose confederation of like-minded terrorists or groups, or simply a metastasized idea with viral appeal? Frankly, I think Al-Qaeda is a hybrid of those three, a three-headed beast, if you will, comprised of the Al-Qaeda core, as Mr. Clarke mentioned, the Al-Qaeda regional affiliates and like-minded groups, and the Al-Qaeda-inspired radicalization and threats that we face. Al-Qaeda core leadership, largely contained in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, has continued to set the strategic direction for the movement and has directed attack plotting. At the same time, Al-Qaeda has aggressively and systematically moved to establish, co-opt, and use regional affiliates like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as forward bases for terrorist activity and strategic reach. Until the Christmas Day attack, these regional groups confined their activities largely to their respective regions. The most troubling revelation on Christmas was that Al-Qaeda was trying to hit the United States directly from its outpost in Yemen. The constellation of terrorist groups that have direct ties, associations, or parallel ideological agendas with Al-Qaeda is constantly shifting. This, I think, has been facilitated by the safe haven and training grounds present in western Pakistan and in other regions around the world like Somalia, Yemen, and the Maghreb. Aside from the direct threat to the United States, there's a danger that some subset of these regional organizations or groups could evolve into a new global syndicate, even absent AQ core involvement. In addition, one of the more sophisticated of the like-minded groups, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, called LT by some, could alter its regional focus and become a global leader and successor to Al-Qaeda, taking up the mantle to defend all Muslims. We've seen glimpses of this in the Mumbai attacks and with the uncovered plotting against the Danish newspaper that published the Muhammad cartoons. The mere existence of these groups is dangerous and needs to be viewed as a potential next phase in the war on terror. In addition, Al-Qaeda has identified and nurtured pockets of radicalized cells and individuals in Western Europe and around the world with the capability to carry out deadly attacks under Al-Qaeda direction and under its banner. The long-term threat from Al-Qaeda comes in the allure of its ideology to individuals who may decide to commit acts of terror. Through its propaganda, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have created a symbolic brand that identifies Al-Qaeda as the leader of this movement. This has been amplified by the radicalization of individuals via the internet and via ideologues. This ideology, as you all know, preys on discontent and alienation while providing a simple narrative that pretends to grant meaning and heroic outlet for the young. As you know, the Al-Qaeda narrative is simple. The West is at war with Islam. Muslims have a religious obligation to engage in jihad to defend fellow Muslims. The U.S. is the head of the snake, the far enemy that must be fought along with apostate allies. And Al-Qaeda is the ultimate vanguard of this movement for all Muslims. to disaffected or troubled individuals, this narrative explains in a simple framework the ills around them and the geopolitical discord they see on their television sets and on the internet. There are some concerning elements to these recent cases of radicalization within the U.S. which I think are important to note. Unlike in past cases, some of the individuals involved appeared to be second or third generation Americans who were born into Islam as opposed to being converts to the faith. They appear to have acted in clusters, as with the American Somalis in Northern Virginia 5, and they attempted to join or succeeded in connecting with a known terrorist organization abroad. These factors are troubling, especially given the effectiveness of Al-Qaeda and extremists like Anwar al-Awlaki to use the internet to draw new adherents, including from the West. This environment then, I think, suggests that more individuals will be radicalized over time and could take on the global terrorist mantle. And the metastasized dimension of this terrorist problem is perhaps the most bedeviling, since it is diffuse, local, or even personal in nature and hard to counter. And I think this ideological battlefield is where the long war, the generational battle, will be fought. Mr. Chairman, if I could just quickly lay out what I think, which is presented in my written testimony, should be the U.S. response to Al-Qaeda. We should pressure Al-Qaeda on all fronts, without a doubt. It's essential that AQ core be dismantled. The core of Al-Qaeda is the heart of the global Sunni terrorist movement, and though its destruction ultimately will not end terrorism or the allure of its ideology, it's a key and important step to disabling the global terrorist network. The U.S. and the international community has to deny physical safe haven to terrorist groups. We need to shift the momentum against the Taliban in Afghanistan. We need to enable the Pakistanis to continue their fight against the Pakistan Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the tribal regions. We must continue our support to Yemen to root out Al-Qaeda elements. Along with regional partners, we should help defend the fledgling transitional federal government in Somalia. And we must ensure that the Iraqi government is able to solidify security against AQI and other violent extremist groups. We also need an all-out offensive in the ideological battle, with a concentration on networking and empowering grassroots counter-movements against Al-Qaeda. Importantly, all quarters in Muslim communities are now openly challenging Al-Qaeda. And though the United States is not a central protagonist in this battle within Islam, it has a key role to play. Aside from promoting democracy, defending our policies and values, and demonstrating that the West is not at war with Islam, the United States should be actively countering this narrative and the violent extremist ideology. The goal should be to help foment and network a global grassroots counter-movement through the credible voices emerging to counter Al-Qaeda in both the physical and virtual worlds. At the end of the day, this opposition must be organic and come from within Muslim communities, and I think Muslim Americans then have a special responsibility to stand up against this ideology. We need to continue to build a layered defense against strategically significant terrorist attacks. This requires a continual renewal of our commitment to intelligence gathering and prevention as the primary principles guiding our homeland defense. We should redouble our efforts to improve identity management, to include integration of biometric-based technologies. In addition, we should continue to extend our borders with initiatives like the Container Security Initiative that should expand the notion of expanding our borders beyond our shores. And importantly, and this is something my colleagues have argued for, we must push government agencies to imagine the unimaginable by continuing to invest resources and energy to prevent terrorist groups from developing, acquiring, or using weapons of mass destruction. This then also extends to investment of resources in creating resiliency in our critical infrastructure, to include our cyber infrastructure. Lastly, our efforts to defeat Al-Qaeda, I believe, require a long-term legal framework to address the 21st century threat. There is still no established consensus about how to hold suspect terrorists and insurgents in a seemingly endless global conflict in which the theaters of conflict range from recognized war zones and ungoverned havens to city centers and suburban neighborhoods. Whatever form this takes, I think the United States needs to establish transparent rules for justifying continued detention while protecting basic individual rights, and it will need to gain some degree of international legitimacy. I think this can only be achieved if the President and Congress commit capital and credibility to establishing such a system that can then be defended in the U.S. courts and in the court of public opinion. Mr. Chairman, Al-Qaeda and the movement it represents is an enemy that is morphing in structure and adapting to changing geopolitical landscapes, but one that retains the same radical vision and ideology and devotion to the use of terrorism. We must hasten the demise of Al-Qaeda while containing the post-Al-Qaeda terrorist threat and the violent ideology that it has spawned. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Coll. Make sure the microphone is on, please.
My fault.
There you
Thank
go.
you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member McKeon, members of the committee, for this opportunity to testify. I agree with the previous speakers about virtually everything they had to say. I'll try to briefly offer a few complementary angles of vision. I agree also with my predecessor that Al-Qaeda presents a paradox today. Its political and ideological support in the Muslim world has been declining, and yet it remains resilient as a source of disruptive terrorist violence. And part of the explanation lies in the complexity of what we mean by Al-Qaeda. It's evolved to a point where it is really several things at once. It's a specific organization with 21 years of history and the same emir and deputy emir who were appointed at the first meetings in Peshawar in the summer of 1988. That organization remains intact, and it manages through the same Shura committees that it began with. It's also a network of like-minded groups, a network that was really formally organized in the 1990s. It's evolved and changed shape, but it's still around as originally conceived. And Al-Qaeda is also a movement, an ideology, a brand. As a political movement, I think Al-Qaeda is failing. Multiple polls have described the decline in public support for its tactics throughout the Islamic world since about 2005. One recent particularly rigorous poll found that support for Al-Qaeda directed attacks against American civilians in the U.S. homeland is virtually negligible across a diverse array of heavily populated Muslim majority countries. In Pakistan, for example, where anti-American feeling has reached a fever pitch, only 9% supported such attacks against U.S. civilians. In Indonesia, the number was about 5%. It's common to observe that bin Laden's poll ratings have fallen because Al-Qaeda-inspired violence has taken so many Muslim civilian lives since 2001, but the data actually suggests that citizens in Islamic countries, as elsewhere, overwhelmingly disapprove of all indiscriminate violence against civilians, no matter who carries it out and no matter what the cause. Despite its growing isolation, however, Al-Qaeda remains resilient and dangerous, in large part because its central and original organization and its leadership remains in the field. And I think we should be cautious about declaring that central organization disabled. My colleague Peter Bergen has documented that one easily observed measure of the degree of activity of central Al-Qaeda is available in its media operations through As-Sahab, the number of releases it puts out from year to year. In 2008, those operations seem to have come under severe pressure and have been reduced, but this year they've bounced back again, despite the pressure that U.S. military activity and drone attacks have obviously placed on the leadership and the impact that has had. And these succession of small to modest-sized plots, many of them fortunately unsuccessful, have produced a pattern of open-source evidence that clearly implicates support from Al-Qaeda technicians or leaders in Pakistan or elsewhere along the border. All of these plots make clear that the group retains enough breathing space to launch operations that could, as Mr. Clarke pointed out, but for the operation of a single detonator, claim hundreds of lives in an instance. I think the Flight 253 plot did bring to the fore a pattern of evidence about Al-Qaeda's specific resilience in Yemen that's been accumulating for some time. The group's presence and connections there, of course, date back 2 decades. The resilience that presented itself on Christmas is probably traceable to the period immediately after Saudi Arabia's crackdown on Al-Qaeda in 2003, when Yemen started to reemerge as a refuge and a regional haven. In the Pakistan and Afghanistan region, Al-Qaeda's like-minded allies, I think, are far more robust than they are in Yemen. The number of sworn Al-Qaeda members operating along the Afghan-Pakistan border probably is only a few hundred, but the Afghan Taliban's allied fighting forces, though largely regional, are not exclusively regional in their focus and number, of course, in the many thousands. And the Pakistani Taliban are equally estimated to number in the thousands. Perhaps the most potent of these groups in the Pakistan-Afghan region is Lashkar-e-Taiba, which has been mentioned a couple of times before. It's an India-focused group, and along with splinters like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and various cells that spin off from those, they've been able to recruit very talented operatives from educated classes in urban centers. I think this makes them distinctive in comparison to the Afghan Taliban, for example. Lashkar's ranks include scores of volunteer doctors and postgraduate professionals. If one of these sub-networks did find the time and space to reform and plot an attempt of the Mumbai type, it could create far more destructive effects than is typically available to these single operators and small groups that Al-Qaeda has been organizing. In my own judgment, I think Mumbai is actually the most serious warning in the succession of plots, along with the 2006 attempted planes bombing conspiracy in Britain, simply because of its scale and what it tells you about the geographical space and the time and unmolested time that the Mumbai organizers had to carry off a very creative and complicated attack. And I think that is a risk we should be mindful of, even though it doesn't necessarily involve the direct targeting of the U.S. homeland. Let me conclude by stepping back from that observation just to say that I think in a strategic or global sense, Al-Qaeda seems to be in the process of defeating and isolating itself. Its political isolation in the Muslim world has set the stage for the United States and allied governments with persistence and concentrated effort to finally destroy central Al-Qaeda's leadership along the Afghan-Pakistan border. That achievement, as the previous speakers have pointed out, would not end terrorism or end the problem of radical Islamist violence, but it would provide justice for the victims of 9/11, and it would also contribute to freedom of maneuver for the United States and its allies as they continue this generation-long campaign. It would also end the debilitating and destabilizing narrative of the hunt and escape that has elevated the reputations of bin Laden and his deputy al-Zawahiri for so long. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Coll. Mr. McKeon. Who's next? Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses. Gentlemen, I've listened hopefully very attentively to what each of you have said. What I think I find missing is, if you were given a free hand, if you were the commander-in-chief and you had Congress that would cooperate with you unflinchingly, what would you do different than we're doing right now?
Congressman, I think implicit in your question is that we should be doing something different. And what I'm trying to say is that you should not, just because there was an almost successful attack over Detroit, conclude that we're not being successful. I think we are being successful. I think the administration, long before the incident in Detroit, the administration focused on the growing threat in Yemen and was acting successfully against that threat in Yemen. It wasn't getting a lot of press attention, but there was a very effective U.S. government activity for most of last year in Yemen. And we were significantly destroying the leadership of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula long before the media even learned what AQAP stood for. So don't conclude automatically that we need to do something different. And don't conclude that if we're only doing the right things, Al-Qaeda will disappear overnight. This is the work of a generation. We are well on track to eliminating Al-Qaeda Central as a significant threat. We have greatly improved our homeland security. It'll never be perfect. Don't expect it ever will be. Don't expect we'll ever be able to stop every attack. I think if you were to look at all of the things that the administration is doing and other allied governments are doing, the area that probably needs the most reinforcement is the ideological counterweight that my colleagues have talked about. It's really not something the United States government can do overtly. It is best done by Muslim governments, and Muslim governments have actually done a very good job. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, United Arab Emirates, other countries have really done a very effective job of creating an ideological counterweight domestically inside their country. And that wasn't always the case, but I think it is now. They're doing it without U.S. involvement, which is great, because U.S. involvement probably wouldn't help. But there are things the United States can do, and if there were one area where I would strengthen our efforts, it would be in the somewhat fuzzy and hard to define area of creating an ideological counterweight.
Sir.
Congressman, it's a great question. I agree with Mr. Clarke, but I think there are three areas where we can continue to improve, in particular to deal with the movement. And I think Mr. Clarke is right to point out that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of assuming that we have failed because of what happened on Christmas Day. I think people have short memories, and I think we've, over the last 8 years, disrupted numerous plots. Mr. Coll mentioned the August 2006 Atlantic airline plot, which would have been a devastating attack, which with help from the Pakistani government and the UK government, we were able to disrupt with great effect. And so I would say we've done a very good job, and as Mr. Coll indicated as well, Al-Qaeda is self-imploding. The very nature of its exclusionary ideology and its violent tactics is not only an inherent part of their DNA in terms of what they do and what they want to do as an organization, but it's also inherently alienating to the very constituencies that they're trying to attract. And I think the grand lesson from Iraq with the Al-Anbar awakening is the fact that the Iraqis themselves, in the heart of what is supposed to be Al-Qaeda's core constituency, rose up physically against Al-Qaeda and have largely rejected Al-Qaeda, which I think to a certain extent was the beginning of the end for Al-Qaeda, an existential threat. But three areas I would suggest some attention. Dealing with safe havens to avoid these regional groups or militant insurgencies from becoming regional problems or even global platforms. That entails not just dealing with the current problems like Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, but looking beyond the horizon to potential problems in places like Bangladesh, northern Nigeria, and other parts where there is already sectarian tension, where there are forces of radicalization trying to act like leeches to exacerbate those conflicts, and where you have the potential for Al-Qaeda to really make hay in places like that. So I think we need to be forward-looking. Countering the narrative is huge, and I think the U.S. does have a role to play in terms of working with the private sector with credible voices, groups like the Quilliam Foundation in London, ex-extremists who've come out now fighting against their former mates, who are literally organizing against radicalization. These are the kinds of groups we need to support, network, without tainting. And then finally, the legal framework. I think we need to end what has largely become a political football with respect to how we treat this problem for the long term, because it is a long-term problem. This isn't just a problem of Guantanamo. It's a problem of the legal framework long term, and we need to resolve that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Perhaps because I'm a scientist, but I think that numbers really do have significance. In a recent briefing before this committee, I asked the four experts their estimate of how many radical Islamists they thought there were in the world that disliked us and would hurt us if they could. Two of them said order of magnitude 10,000. A third one said 100,000. And the fourth one said in terms of our ability to count them, essentially an infinite number. We have about a bit less than 200 in Guantanamo Bay with a 20% recidivism rate. That would mean that if those 20% return to the battlefield, that would increase the number from 10,000, 100,000, or essentially an infinite number to a number that really is lost in our estimate. But I know we're not dealing with a practical reality world here. We're dealing very largely with emotion and political issues. And so I know that the importance of these 40 is hugely more than the infinitesimal number that they would add to the international radical Islamists who hate us would wish us ill and would hurt us if they could. I was impressed with a statement that Admiral Olson made before this committee. Special Operation Forces must focus on the environmental dynamics and root causes that create today's and tomorrow's threats and adversaries. Furthermore, a solution is often as diverse as the threat and requires an approach that is integrated with the long-term work of civilian agencies, especially the State Department and USAID, to foster U.S. credibility and influence among relevant populations. In this committee, we focus primarily on military. In terms of a percentage of the effective weapons that we have to fight against these international threats, how large do you think the military is as compared with the others which Admiral Olson mentioned before this committee?
Congressman, I think obviously in Afghanistan, the United States military is our principal weapon in fighting against the Taliban. If you can put Afghanistan aside, and that's asking a lot, but if you consider the rest of the world where the threats exist, I think the military is a valuable tool, probably of equal importance with the FBI and law enforcement cooperation, probably of equal importance with the State Department and AID. I don't think it's primarily a military issue, and I think the dialogue that has occurred over the last 10 years, at least, about whether it's a military issue or a law enforcement issue misses the point. It's not a military or a political issue or a sociological. It's all of the above. And the only way for us to combat it effectively is to use all the weapons available to the United States. And certainly some of our military is a valuable weapon on some occasions in some environments. But it's not an either-or situation. Law enforcement plays a very, very critical role, as does intelligence. And as you suggest, going after the root causes is also valuable in some countries. So we need to tailor our response depending upon where we're operating, and we need to use everything we've got.
Congressman, I'm a huge fan of Admiral Olson's and the Special Operations community, and I think as we look forward to the nature of asymmetric warfare, we're going to be relying more and more on special forces in environments of concern and interest, both in preparation of the battlefield and in trying to determine what national resources we can bring to bear. I would just say we need to remember some important lessons over the last 8 years where we have been successful. If you look at Southeast Asia, where all of the experts in 2001 and 2002 were expecting the second front in the war on terror to emerge, given Al-Qaeda's presence there, their deep ties to local groups like Jemaah Islamiyah and Abu Sayyaf group. There has been incredible success, I think, in not only disrupting those networks, but disrupting their regional and global reach. And part of that has been the work of the special ops community. Part of it has been the work of locals. And I think that's a good formula to look at in the future.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Clarke, let me ask you, what would victory against Al-Qaeda look like?
Mr. Chairman, I think if we look out maybe 20 years from now, if we're lucky, and there isn't an Al-Qaeda, there isn't a structured organization known as Al-Qaeda, and more importantly, if the violent Islamic ideology represented by Al-Qaeda is significantly on the wane, then I think we would be able to declare victory. The ideology is never going to go away. It's been around for 1,000 years. It comes and goes. There are waves in Islamic history of this sort of deviant, distorted strain of Islam, just as there were in Christianity for hundreds of years. So I think it's always going to be there. But if we can make it a small minority view in the Islamic world, and if we can eliminate the structured organization, then I think we can declare success. But we'll never be in a situation where there are no violent Islamic cells anywhere in the world. For us, we need to determine success in part by eliminating organizations that threaten the United States, that see as their primary purpose going after what they call the far enemy. Those are the ones that should be our highest priority.
How do you get at the Islamists who will always have a violent streak in them?
I think what's proven so effective so far is to have respected imams in the community explain in the mosque on Fridays why the things that are being said by Al-Qaeda are lies, why they are distortions. To do that at the community level throughout the Muslim world. That is being done in a lot of countries, and it's being done quietly, but I think very effectively. We now also, however, need to bring that message into the Internet and into the cyberspace, because we've seen all too often that individuals have been recruited remotely. People who've never been to an Al-Qaeda meeting, never been to a rally, never been to any place where a group assembled, were nonetheless converted. And this is very frightening. It's very frightening to our Muslim friends that really well done Internet appeals have touched a responsive chord in many Muslim youth. And then, having been converted on the Internet, they then go out and try to find organizations, try to find a way of affiliating and actually plugging in to Al-Qaeda. We do not yet, as far as I know, have in any country an effective cyberspace presence of the effort, the ideological effort that is the counterweight to Al-Qaeda.
Dr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this excellent hearing. I applaud all three of you. It's always a good sign, our etiquette here is that two witnesses are chosen by the majority and one by the minority, and it's always a good sign when we can't tell which is which. And I applaud you for your analysis and your thoughtful efforts to try to help your country. I'm reminded of Mr. Jim Saxton, former member, who was also worked very hard in a nonpartisan manner, and he pushed for a panel that was established on terrorism. We had a meeting in July of 2000, and this is what he said in his opening statement. As a further example, the relatively new terrorist group Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden, may foreshadow a new trend toward relatively self-sufficient terrorist organizations that sustain themselves and operate independently of a state sponsor. That was a year and a half before the 2001 attacks. We're now a decade later, and I appreciate your ongoing efforts here. The second point I wanted to make was I think you, Mr. Coll, talked about we need to not make any provocative mistakes or acts, and I think both a couple of you referred to the Abu Ghraib experience in the photographs. At that time, I had a couple of Egyptian interns that were with me for a couple of weeks, and one of them was a young woman, liked America a lot, liked Americans, excellent English language skills, and I asked her what she thought about those photographs that came out when they were first released. She was very polite. She said, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. It may be able to be explained. She said, but when I saw those photographs, I felt like it was me on the floor of that prison cell. And here, this was a young woman in America, likes Americans, and you put yourself in the position of somebody who may not be very pro-American and a young male, you can understand your admonition, Mr. Coll, to avoid mistakes and provocative acts. Mr. Zarate, I think you in your statement more completely than the other two witnesses talk about some of these other areas around the world and make some, I think, very good suggestions. You specifically mentioned Algeria and Morocco, and it gives me a chance to say something about the good work that Ambassador Christopher Ross is doing to try to resolve the issues between the Polisario and Morocco, because until those results, until those efforts, that conflict gets resolved, it's going to be very, very difficult for Morocco and Algeria to come together and the region gets settled. And of course, our attention doesn't get on these intractable conflicts that have been going on for several decades. But I think your statement today adds weight of why we need not to ignore these conflicts that unfortunately sometimes get used to, when in fact the people in the area very much want to resolve them, and we need to help them. And I again applaud Chris Ross's efforts. The question I wanted to ask is, and maybe I'll use the Flight 253 for the question. What is that group trying to accomplish? I think you Mr. Coll, says it has very little strategic significance. Have their goals changed? What are they trying to accomplish? What we've said in the past is the goal of Al-Qaeda is to get the United States to remove its troops from Muslim lands and stop supporting Israel. I'd like to hear from you, the three of you, briefly. What do you think the goal was of that attack and other attacks at this stage?
Well, I think Al-Qaeda leaders explained their reasoning repeatedly, and they want to hold the United States directly to account for what they regard as its aggressive policies in the Muslim world. Bin Laden always uses the phrase raid to describe what we would correctly see as mass murder, but he sees it in this sort of narrative of both political and millenarian violence that he imagines himself leading. So the group in Yemen is a little bit more muted about their own particular ideology, but when you read into the preachers around what we understand to be the group that recruited and equipped the Flight 253 attacker, it is the same narrative of direct violence against the United States that is associated both with political but also millenarian narratives.
Congressman, in terms of the actual attack, this is the manifestation of Al-Qaeda's strategy to try to use the regional outpost. And the outpost in Yemen is the most dangerous because you have seasoned Al-Qaeda members, long ties to bin Laden in the core group, directing their attention to the west. This has been the intention of Al-Qaeda for some time, but they pressed this in 2005, 2006. And if you recall the Zawahiri-Zarqawi letter from 2005 that laid this strategy out in the context of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But that's precisely what they've been trying to do in the Maghreb and in Yemen, and unfortunately this is a manifestation of that very strategy. But I would say in terms of long-term, what Al-Qaeda has in mind is long-term conflict with the U.S. They have in mind that the notion of bankrupting us, bleeding us of blood and treasure, thinking of the model of the Soviets in Afghanistan. And I think that is really driving bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's thinking these days. And any kind of attack that disrupts us, that forces us to fight amongst ourselves and to spend resources is a victory for them in their minds.
If I could just add very briefly, I do think they want us to overreact. They talk about that a fair amount, and that's part of the way they get us toward this strategy of what they imagine are leading us to bankruptcy.
Sir, I think their ultimate goal, as they've declared it, is to replace the governments in the Islamic countries, to overthrow the government of Saudi Arabia, overthrow the government of Egypt. That's their ultimate goal. And they seek to get us out of the region by increasing the pain upon us, because they believe we are propping up those governments. What's interesting is that their long-term goal, overthrowing the government of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, replacing those governments with Al-Qaeda governments, is as far away from ever happening as it could possibly be. The chances of them ever achieving their ultimate goal are close to zero.
Thank you all for your work.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, given the high recidivism rates that we've observed, is transferring detainees to other countries an acceptable risk when they can easily return to Al-Qaeda's ranks, either because of a lack of effective monitoring or because of inadequate legal and prison systems?
Congressman, I think it's something we've got to be worried about, and worried about even more so with the present population in Guantanamo, which represents a more hardened group of terrorists and folks connected to Al-Qaeda. We've seen in the past, the numbers vary from anywhere from 7% to 20%, but I think recidivism rates would likely go much higher if some of these individuals are released without the proper security constraints on the back end. And I think that's critical. We've got to be sure if we are transferring individuals. The Bush administration did so, as I was a part of, over 530 such individuals transferred out of Guantanamo. You've got to be sure that you have the right security measures on the back end. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past is those security measures aren't foolproof, and we've seen members return to the battlefield. So we've got to be very cautious about this.
If I could just add, I think it's important to manage these risks with eyes on the strategic context. There have been two administrations on a bipartisan basis that have come to the view that the provocation that Guantanamo represents outstrips the benefits of its specific location as a detention center. President Bush announced his desire to close the facility for that reason, and President Obama has followed. Both presidents and their staffs have wrestled with the extraordinary complexity of the case files and the risks associated with those case files. But I do think it's important to understand that the strategic goal here is to create a context in which Al-Qaeda continues to isolate itself in the Muslim world, and Guantanamo is a factor in the provocative narrative that Al-Qaeda has sought to exploit.
Congressman, I think there are two separate issues here. One is, should we be releasing these people at all? And if so, with what criteria? And two, if we keep them, where we keep them? I think they're very separate issues. And obviously, I think the first question answers itself. As Juan suggested, we've been releasing them for several years now. We've learned something in the process. I think some of the initial prisoners that were released in the Bush administration turned out they shouldn't have been released. I think we've learned that there are countries such as Yemen that probably can't handle it right now. And therefore, we have to be very careful. But there have been other cases that have been quite successful. So it has been, in both of the last two administrations, something that was considered on a case-by-case basis. And I think we have to continue to do that, learning from our past mistakes. The second issue of, if we're going to keep some number of them, is it important that they be kept in Cuba? And I have never understood the logic that says there's some value of having them in Cuba as opposed to someplace else. I do think that having them in Cuba has become a tool that the Al-Qaeda propaganda machine uses against us. Is it going to solve the world's problems to take that one talking point away from Al-Qaeda? No, it's not. But I don't see why we should continue to hand them a propaganda point by continuing to keep Guantanamo open. I think moving them to someplace else would probably have some minor value. It's probably worth doing.
I think that, there's been references to the past administration, this administration. I'm not trying to make this a political issue at all. To me, it's just a rational issue or a economic issue. Because when we had briefings here before the holidays, in 3 briefings we were told how much it was going to cost to move the detainees to Illinois and to New York, and we were talking over $500 million. And given our economic situation, it's hard for me to see how that could possibly be justified. But back to the point of where we transfer them, if they're going to be transferred, is it unreasonable to require that a receiving country not be a state sponsor of terrorism, that it be able to secure and exercise control over its territory, such that terrorist groups do not enjoy a safe haven, and that confirmed cases of Guantanamo detainees released to its custodies are being returned to terrorism? That's my concern.
Well, sir, I think we need to develop criteria, and I think probably both the last two administrations have had criteria. We need to keep adjusting them as to whether or not the country receiving them is on the state sponsor list or not. There are probably some countries on the state sponsor list would be pretty good places to send them. I think certainly the government in Syria, which has been on the state sponsored list, government of Syria is about as opposed to Al-Qaeda as we are, and has proven that over and over again, is unlikely to release Al-Qaeda people. But the other criteria you mentioned, whether or not they're able to hold them, would suggest that places like Yemen, which is not on the state sponsor list, probably shouldn't be receiving them right now.
Congressman, I think we need to learn lessons and adjust our criteria accordingly, and I think we've learned some lessons from those we've already released. And I think the criteria needs to take into account the shifting international security context. And I think The Obama administration was wise to withhold transferring further Yemenis, given the situation in that country. And so I think that's very important. If I could just mention very quickly on the Guantanamo question again, I think the underlying issue with Guantanamo, for which it is a symbol, is the question of how we hold individuals in this long-term battle. And if we are going to have a preventive detention model, in many ways the locale, the venue, doesn't matter. The issue is whether or not we can legitimately defend the system by which we hold such individuals, especially if they're not going to be held to account in a recognizable court of law. And so I think one of the things this administration really needs to grapple with, and it's part of my testimony, is how do you frame that legal framework, and how do you defend it? And part of that defense may be going back and looking at the fact, and I've heard this from my friends at Amnesty International, that Guantanamo is actually a fairly good place to be held as a detainee, with the facilities that have been built, with Attorney General Holder going down and saying it's a prison that's being well run. And so this may be a time to reflect on whether or not we defend the very notion of Guantanamo as part of a preventive detention model that we have to defend for the long term.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, let me start out by saying I'm hearing just a little bit of a thread here in most of the testimony that talks about taking away talking points from Al-Qaeda. And I think, Mr. Clarke, in your written testimony, your 6 points said that completing the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from Iraq is an important component on the ideological front. And I understand that. I just would remind all of us in 2001 there were no U.S. combat forces in Iraq or Afghanistan. There was no Gitmo, and yet the U.S. was brutally and viciously attacked by Al-Qaeda Central, I believe as you refer to it. And it occurs to me that one of the reasons that we're having this discussion about Al-Qaeda is not because they're so powerful. It's because they have demonstrated an intensity of ideology that overwhelms us just by their commitment to do us harm. And it occurs to me that there are two primary components to the threat that they compose. Number one is that intent, and number two would be their capacity to carry it out. And I feel like this notion that we better take away their talking points is kind of dangerous because it belies what we already know about their intractable intent. So let me start there, but my question is that we have to focus on this thing called capacity. And nothing, of course, I don't think concerns any of us more than Al-Qaeda or groups with that mindset gaining access to weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear yield weapons. So what can we do today? I'm hoping the entire panel will discuss this. I understand we're not in a closed session, so you'll have to adjust accordingly. But what can we do today to prevent the proliferation of WMD from places like Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea, to eliminate the possibility of a nuclear-armed Al-Qaeda? I just am so convinced that that wipes all other issues off the table if terrorists gain access to even one nuclear weapon, because then the response of the free world that follows, everything is a completely new world. And so what are we doing to focus on preventing the capacity of Al-Qaeda to do us harm, especially them gaining access to nuclear capability? And I'll start with you, Mr. Coll.
I think the single most important goal in that respect ought to be to create conditions in which Pakistan stabilizes and is able and increasingly is willing to take the steps necessary to eliminate extremist ideology from Pakistani soil and to stop using extremist groups as a proxy for Pakistani regional foreign policy goals. And in order to create conditions for Pakistan to stabilize in that way, it's going to be necessary, at least in the medium run, to create conditions for normalization between India and Pakistan so that they don't embark on a nuclear arms race that only exacerbates the dangers to the entire world of a nuclear arsenal in Pakistan that's vulnerable to an insider threat over time.
Mr. Zarate.
Congressman, on your first point, I couldn't agree more. I think we've got to be careful not to give Al-Qaeda heckler's veto over our policies, because I think they do have a centuries-long view of their grievances. that shift with the political winds, and I think we see that time and again with the statements coming out of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, now focused on our support for Israel, in the past our military presence in other conflicts. And so if it's not one excuse, it's going to be another, and I think we need to be careful, although we shouldn't be handing them free gifts from a propaganda perspective. On the WMD front, I'm actually quite proud of the work we did on this. I think we laid out a very powerful six-part strategy. It's laid out in the 2006 National Strategy for Combating Terrorism. But two quick points. I agree with Mr. Coll that on the nuclear front, the center of gravity is Pakistan, where we've seen Pakistani scientists in the past associated in helping Al-Qaeda. And I think we've got to be very careful with the dimensions of capacity and expertise that Al-Qaeda could gain from the Pakistani nuclear complex. On the bio side, I think we've got to worry very diligently about the expansion of biolabs around the world, in some places in ungoverned or undergoverned parts of the world. That is dangerous as we look at potentially toxins and pathogens used by terrorist groups.
On the WMD issue is the classic low probability, high impact analytical problem. And it raises the question, as all of those kinds of problems do, how do you spend your dollar, how do you spend your time? Because you could spend the whole gross national product dealing with this issue. The place that I think deserves more attention on the nuclear issue, putting aside biological and chemical, on the nuclear issue, the place that I think deserves more attention is not the security of weapons, because that has attention, but the security of nuclear material. There are hundreds of tons of enriched uranium around the world that are not properly audited, accounted for, and secured, and we haven't done a good job on that issue, and that's where I'd put the attention.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would agree with that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just have three quick points and then one question. First of all, definitely I want to thank Mr. Zarate and Mr. Clarke for making a couple points that I think are very critical that we move past. I mean, first of all, Mr. Clarke's point about the choice between this being a law enforcement issue and a military issue. It's no choice at all. It's both, and a lot of other things in between, and we shouldn't waste too much time debating that. We should debate how to do each piece of it best and making sure that we don't miss any of them. And then also, both of you made the point on the issue of the detainee policy. We've been, obsessed with where we hold them, when in fact I think the larger and more difficult issues is, how do we hold them, and who do we hold and who don't we hold, and what are the criteria. We have the issue of the people who we are not going to try in any court, but we have to hold. How do we justify that policy and defend it? And I think that should be the focus of that debate. And I hope from your mouths to God's ears, if you will, that hopefully we will continue to move in that direction. And then on the propaganda point, I agree with Mr. Franks that we should not be at all concerned with how Al-Qaeda is going to react to whether or not Guantanamo is open, where we try people, what our policies are in Afghanistan. There are, however, other voices in the Muslim world that we better pay attention to. Jordan, a strong ally. Our policies will impact their ability to continue to have their citizens agree with us. Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, many places look at our policies, whether it's Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, what goes on in Afghanistan, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and these are allies that we should care about, and I hope we don't forget about that point. Question has to do with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and how close they are. There's many different varieties of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Seems to me critical to success there would be separating them off from Al-Qaeda. We're not going to eliminate the Taliban in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. What do you think about the relationship right now between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in both Afghanistan and Pakistan? I understand that we're talking about a complex set of groups here, but what can we do to separate them so that if Al-Qaeda has some degree of influence anywhere, that doesn't automatically mean that Al-Qaeda does? Is that even possible? Mr. Coll, if you want.
I think the relationship is probably closest between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban, particularly the Massoud nexus of the Pakistani Taliban. There's also long historical ties that must be continuing between the Haqqani network, which is a sort of semi-independent element of the Afghan Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. In a strategic sense, Al-Qaeda is clearly enabling both Taliban by distributing insight into tactics, bomb-making, and media operations. Think of just the oxymoron of the phrase Taliban media operations. In the 1990s, that basically involved covering up oil paintings in Kabul ministries, and today they're putting out many more videos than even Al-Qaeda is. So Al-Qaeda clearly has an effect on these groups. How to separate them? Ultimately, it requires a strategy that persuades many Taliban leaders that their interests are regional and local and political, that they are territorial. And that
how are we doing on that front, and what can we be doing better?
I think we're just beginning to construct a strategy in Afghanistan, and we're way behind in building a partnership with the Pakistani government that would lead to an effective approach to their western frontier and domestic insurgency.
I would agree with Mr. Colt's assessment, but I would say that in terms of Pakistan, the Pakistani government has to have a different view for the long-term commitment they have to the tribal areas. We saw, for example, in 2006, the peace deal with the tribes in North Waziristan and South Waziristan, which eliminated the pressure that Al-Qaeda was under at the time and the incentives that the tribes actually had then to negotiate and work with the central government in Pakistan. There was a withdrawal of forces, a withdrawal of checks, of enforcement of that deal. And I think that's what gave Al-Qaeda some breathing space at the time, and some other terrorist groups some breathing space in western Pakistan. We are now, as we see with Secretary Gates going to Islamabad, pushing the Pakistanis to make their way back into North Waziristan, which I think is the next important battle space. And I think part of this is physical pressure. Part of it is negotiation with purse and other goodies that the tribals like, including influence. And I think part of this is a political solution on the other side of the border in Kabul.
I'd agree with all of that, but I think in answer to your question, what should we be doing? I think General McChrystal probably is doing it on the Afghan side, and that is to say that he understands the Taliban on the Afghan side are not monolithic, and bits of them can be broken off through a combination of coercion and bribery, to be blunt about it.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for testifying today and for your service to our country in varying capacities. It seems that we have a real concern with failed states or ungovernable areas that have a population of Sunni Muslims, and some of them having a Takfiri view of life that's susceptible to Al-Qaeda. How do we deal with that effectively? Because it seems to be that perhaps in Afghanistan we haven't dealt with it. And some of you have said that it's kind of bled this country dry. But how do we've got not simply Afghanistan, but we've got, and there are ungovernable areas of Pakistan. We've got Somalia as a failed state, and we've got problems with Yemen and some ungovernable areas there that have Al-Qaeda elements now. I mean, how can we best protect our national security interests in those areas and not bleed this country financially? Yes.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because I think we can't be all things to all people, and we can't have boots on the ground for both the symbolic reasons that we've talked about here, but also for resource reasons. I think we need to devise strategies like we did in Southeast Asia, where you have the local authorities with capacity building taking on the fight themselves, both the hard edges of the fight and the soft edges. And you look at things that the Indonesians have done, the Malaysians, with Australian help, with U.S. help, that's been incredibly effective. If you look at Yemen, I think there's a much greater role for Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Gulf states that have in their interest not to have an Al-Qaeda safe haven in their backyard. I think there's a greater role there. In the Maghreb, having Algeria and Morocco work more closely together, that's something we tried to achieve over many years. That's critical. So I think the regional partners have to take the leading role, with the U.S. and other capable Western countries providing support and capacity. That's the only way you're going to contain these problems and then start to deal with them in the long term, which involves development aid, assistance, economic investment, all of which we can't do on our own, and all of which the local authorities and countries and interested parties, whether they're tribal or otherwise, have the most primary interest in affecting.
Anyone else?
Well, I think that's right. I think we can do a lot with a small footprint. I think we're demonstrating that now in Yemen. We've tried in Somalia. Somalia is a difficult problem. But I think there are ways to extend central government into some of these ungoverned regions through a combination of development aid and security aid. And we can use U.S. Special Operations Forces and others in small numbers to help achieve that. I think it's a big mistake to think that we only can help these people by putting in a large American aid footprint or a large American military footprint. In fact, that probably is counterproductive. What's interesting is in places like Yemen, it's not so much a problem that there isn't enough money to do the development aid. There's plenty of money pledged by the Saudis, the United States, the UAE, and others. The problem has been institution building in the central government so that it can use the money that has been pledged. And that's something where we ought to be able to do a better job.
Coll. I think all of those approaches that Mr. Clarke and Mr. Zarate have outlined are necessary. I think it's important, though, to look at the record of where success has really been achieved and taken hold. And Southeast Asia, I think, is the best example. I traveled in Indonesia this summer, and I was struck by the extent to which the capacity building and the extraordinary success that the government of Indonesia, the government of Malaysia, even the government of Philippines to a degree has had is a product of regional economic integration. I mean, these are middle-income countries that are moving ahead in such a confident way that they are able to muster a national capacity to defeat insurgent groups and to control ungoverned spaces in a way that just wasn't imaginable 20 years ago. So ultimately in the Arab world and in Africa, that kind of momentum, as distant as it looks in a place like Somalia or Yemen, is essential. It's American U.S. aid or boots on the ground is no substitute for national capacity that is built from regional economic momentum.
Let me be specific and say Somalia, which I mean, where we really are talking about a failed state that has no capacity at this time. We have issues of piracy in terms of the pirates having safe harbor there because it's a failed state. We have issues of certainly of Al-Qaeda having a presence there. How do you deal with the situation where there is no capacity?
Somalia is perhaps the most bedeviling of the safe haven problems for all the reasons I think most folks know well. I think part of it is doing precisely what we've tried to do, which is to come up with a political solution where fractious parties within Somalia have a vested interest in building the power of a central government or some semblance of central government. We are getting there, I think, with the Djibouti process that has been supported by the U.S. and other partners. Part of it is having the AU and regional countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, which are not well liked in some instances for obvious reasons, take greater ownership and frankly, help contain the problem while the political process develops and where you have the capacity. But that is a fractious society, a violent society, and one where Al-Qaeda has found allies like Al-Shabaab for some time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. As you know, we're about to start the discussions for the defense budget for 2011, and I'm wondering how you would prioritize our defense spending in relation to Al-Qaeda. Should we be looking away from more conventional forces? How do we balance the threats that Al-Qaeda poses as we look to those issues?
Well, again, putting aside Afghanistan, which is where we are directly using our military to confront Al-Qaeda and its affiliates like the Taliban. Putting aside that, which I think needs to be fully and adequately funded, both on the defense side and on the foreign ops side, probably at least as important on the foreign ops side. I think we need to look at whether or not the Special Forces Command is adequately sized. It's been very strained over the last few years because of, first, its successes in Iraq and now being used extensively in Afghanistan, perhaps in Yemen and elsewhere. That's probably the place where, on the military budget, the greatest contribution can be made.
I would agree with that. I think we need to look to see where we have resources that apply to the asymmetric threat, and I think SOCOM is one example of it, where we have programs that can be applied. I think programs that allow us to build capacity with foreign counterparts. I know the special operations community has built a very important and good global network of special operations forces around the world, including with some Arab allies. And so building that capacity to deal with problems as we see in Yemen or in Somalia or in the Maghreb becomes very important, so that we don't have to put boots on the ground, and we've got good and capable allies that are willing and able to do it. So I think that's important. And then finally, I know this may be outside the purview of this committee, but trying to find a way, perhaps through 1206 funding, to blend the funding that goes to state and DOD for these longer-term development aid and assistance programs in environments where you've got incipient conflicts that need both a security component and a development aid and assistance component. I think that's critical, and I don't think as a bureaucracy we've really figured that out as the U.S. government, and we've struggled with it. I'm sure Dick did in his time in the White House. I did as well.
My colleagues know the programmatic piece is much better than I, but I would step back and just make two quick observations. First, to reinforce the notion of SOCOM's enabling capacity. When you look out over 20 years, one hopes that the stress that special forces have been under in Iraq and Afghanistan will ebb, but the challenge of enabling regional and local capacity will persist. And secondly, if I would scrutinize the strategic communications efforts of the Defense Department in this budgeting cycle, because I do think there's an opportunity and a need to reset on a nonpartisan, serious basis American thinking about strategic communications and where the dollars are going and whether they're effective and how to leverage them successfully. This, again, is a 20-year challenge that's not going to go away, and it would be a good time to start thinking about how to spend effectively to support that goal.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that one of the lessons that we've learned in the last number of years is how to be more efficient in some ways across agencies. But I also am wondering if you could, maybe just point out where are we the most inefficient in trying to work better together to get, to preserve our security in a way that doesn't bankrupt us, bleed us the way that we're seeing today.
Where are we most inefficient? I would have to say, if you look across in terms of the budget, where are we spending money probably least effectively? It's probably in AID, in the Foreign Ops budget, because they tend to go after very large projects which take a long time and aren't immediately seen by the people in the recipient countries necessarily as beneficial. And to the extent that AID has moved in the direction, which it has, of smaller projects that deliver quick hits, quick victories, the way the DOD money has done so well, I think that's probably the place where we could be more efficient.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the challenges for the U.S. government is aligning our development aid and assistance long-term with our short-term national security needs without doing damage to those long-term goals. And so we haven't figured that out yet, and I think Dick is absolutely right in terms of the lack of efficiencies. And I would echo what Mr. Coll said in terms of strategic communications. I think that was something that we left unfinished in the prior administration, figuring out both bureaucratically and programmatically how you deal with this new war, this asymmetric internet-based war in terms of Stratcom's strategy and structure. So that's important. And finally, I would just say, Congressman, I think we as a government need to start thinking more creatively about how we engage, align, and work with private sector actors. I think we don't do it well enough. And what you have facing us is an enemy made up of non-state actors, cells, networks. What we haven't figured out is how to align those good guys on the good side of the ledger to work against those very networks at the local level. And I don't think we're very good at that yet.
Thank you.
Fourth chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania. We have been called for 2 votes, one 15-minute, one 5-minute. It is Chairman Skelton's intention to recognize Mr. Schuster, then break for the votes and come back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Zarate? My Spanish is a little off. You brought up the concern I have about how do we try these terrorists, and it's become a political football. I believe it's become a political football because in my district in rural Pennsylvania, the truck driver, the average American, the average citizen in my district is asking me, why are we giving these people the same rights that American citizens have when they're not? Why did we, the underwear bomber, I understand after 15 minutes of interrogation, they read him his Miranda rights, and he took the advice of the Miranda rights and shut up and waited for his attorney to get there. So that's the reason it's a political football, I believe. I think there is an accepted, credible system out there, and that's the military tribunals. So I'd like to hear your comments on what you think the solution. Do we have the solution in place?
Congressman, I agree with you. I think one of the challenges that this administration faces, and it perhaps is of their own making, and I think to a certain extent it is, especially with the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed decision to bring him to New York and some of his compatriots to face trial in New York, is the lack of clarity as to what exactly is the legal structure and paradigm being applied. Because what you will have in that context is, in essence, a tiered legal system. For the worst of the worst, they are getting the most protections under U.S. law, the same protections you and I would get in a civilian court, while there are lower-level Al-Qaeda individuals who will not face trial at all, will have no due process, as we understand it, in a civilian court, with no explanation as to why that system makes sense or is in concert with the rule of law. And so I think the first thing that needs to happen is a framework that explains these tiers and explains exactly why they're being applied. I'm not against fundamentally, I was a former prosecutor, terrorism prosecutor, to using the criminal legal system, but it's one tool of many and shouldn't necessarily be the first point of entry for these individuals. And I think it goes to the nature of what we're facing. I think we've got to make some choices. If we want intelligence from terrorists we capture, like the Christmas Day bomber, then you don't Mirandize him and you don't put him immediately into the criminal legal system. But it doesn't mean you can't prosecute him later, as we did, for example, with Jose Padilla.
Mr. Clarke, I wondered what your thoughts were. What do you believe Al-Qaeda's view is on the situation where we're bringing him into our federal courts and giving him rights as American citizens? You think that's something they're smiling about when they see that? Does it help their cause?
I don't think they give it 2 seconds thought, and frankly, I'm not sure we should either. The difference between the military tribunals, which you suggest wouldn't have Mirandized the prisoner, and the civil criminal process has been exaggerated. It's really not that different in terms of their rights. I think we have successfully prosecuted a very large number of terrorists under the Bush administration and under the Clinton administration in the federal civil system with very, very high success rates. And I just don't understand why people are afraid of using the federal civil court system, the criminal court system, which has proven to be so effective.
And I would submit, I think the folks in my district are saying because it'll take months and months, if not years, and millions of dollars of money that need to go out to fight terrorism.
Yeah, so will the military system, sir.
What's that?
So will the military tribunal system, sir. It'll take just as long and cost just as much.
Well, I guess time will show us what the facts are on that.
We already have historical data that would suggest that.
Right. The next question I have is concerning, I see my time's running short, so if you don't have an opportunity to answer, if you could give us something in writing. And it's concerning Sheikh Abu Yahya al-Libi, who I keep hearing his name, I've heard him called Bin Laden Jr., and the most effective propagandist they have in getting these young people to come to their cause. So I wondered if all three of you might, and again, we're going to gavel me down here in 40 seconds, so I'll start with you, Mr. Coll, and if you have any views on him and what your thoughts are, if you could comment.
I'd be happy to come back to you in writing about that.
Okay. Mr. Zarate?
Abu Yahya al-Libi is one of the most prominent clerics that Al-Qaeda has. He's become prominent in terms of his sermons and his internet presence. He's gained fame because he escaped from Bagram and that's created more of to his mythos as a leader in Al-Qaeda. And I think he's an important figure that needs to be killed or captured.
Mr. Clarke, any thoughts on him?
I would agree with Juan on that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen from Pennsylvania. I would remind members that we have approximately 6 minutes to make the vote, but it is very much Chairman Skelton's intention to return after those votes.